Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the non-urban passenger transport session of the ITF Transport Outlook launch. A warm welcome to those who have just joined the program, and hello again for those of us who have stayed with us. My name is Malachi Fernando, and I am a co-author and the project manager of this edition of the Outlook, and it is my absolute pleasure today to moderate this session. You will be hearing shortly from my colleagues Dimitrios Papaioannou and Vatsalia Sohu, who will be presenting our findings on the future of non-urban passenger transport. After that, we will be joined by our very special guest, Simone Raua, head of the Aviation Environmental Roadmap at Airbus. She'll be joining us for an interactive discussion, and you'll be welcome to participate in that through the poll on the right-hand side of your screen. Finally, Luis Martinez, the lead modeler of the ITF, will join Dimitrios and Vatsalia to answer your questions during the Q&A portion. So on the right-hand side of your screen, as mentioned, there is a poll question that you can answer at any point from now until after Simone joins us for the discussion. There's also a Q&A box that you're welcome to submit questions to. We will have some time after the presentation to go through them. There's also a discussion box. Now, this is for you to chat with other participants, but it will not be moderated by ITF staff, so please use the Q&A function for questions. Finally, if you are experiencing technical difficulties, please use the live support button on the top right-hand corner of the screen for assistance. And I believe that is it for housekeeping. With that, I will hand it off to Dimitrios and Vatsalia for their presentation. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Here, we will be presenting some of our results, some of the key findings and main takeaways from the non-urban passenger chapter of our Outlook. Myself, Dimitrios Papaioannou, and Vatsalia Sohu will be presenting. Before we start, let's talk a bit what non-urban passenger is. So what do we mean when we're saying non-urban passenger? It is all passenger transport that happens outside and between cities. And I need to clarify this a bit more. When we talk about regional transport, we talk about things happening in rural and peri-urban areas, small daily trips happening by surface modes. When we are talking about intercity transport, we are talking about movements that happen between cities, and they can happen by surface modes or by ferries or by aviation. Now, why is non-urban passenger important? First of all, it represents more than half, about 60% of all passenger activity and the corresponding emissions. And further to that, it is a sector, especially some parts of it, that are notoriously hard to decarbonize. It is much more dependent on fossil fuels compared with some other sectors. Last but not least, it has also been significantly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, activity was reduced by almost 40%. But as everyone knows, the pandemic particularly affected aviation, which faced a total reduction of activity of almost 60%. International aviation was even further affected, mainly due to border closures and quarantine requirements, facing a total reduction of almost 75%. Let's recap very briefly the three policy scenarios that we are testing in this outlook. First of all, we have the recover scenario. The recover scenario talks about our current trajectory, where we are going under our current policies and our announced and planned commitments. We also have the reshape scenario. The reshape scenario talks about a paradigm shift. It talks about scaling up our ambition, talks about going and taking bolder and more ambitious measures and policies. I have to point out that both these scenarios assume that there are no after effects of the pandemic. By 2030, everything is back to normal. This is where our last scenario differ, the reshape plus. In this scenario, we leverage some of the effects of the pandemic to accelerate the uptake and deployment of decarbonization policies, which would allow us to reach our climate goals faster and with more certainty. Now, I'm going to present you some of our key facts, some of our key findings from our modeling work in the transport outlook. Let's talk first about demand. Demand measured in passenger kilometers for non-urban passenger transport, that is for regional and intercity, will grow. It will grow regardless of scenario. In all three scenarios, we are having very significant growth, more than double. As you can see in the graph, the difference between the current trajectory, the recover scenario, and the reshape plus scenario is rather small. We do have growing in both. That is because, as Malithi mentioned in the previous session, demand management for regional and intercity travel is rather hard. However, it is important to point out that we do have a dichotomy in terms of where this growth is coming from. In OECD countries, the growth of the sector is going to be about 40 to 45% in both scenarios shown here. By contrast, the demand for regional and intercity travel in non-OECD countries almost triples. This highlights a departure from OECD countries being the center of non-urban activity globally. By 2050, the developing non-OECD nations will generate the majority of non-urban passenger activity. Let's see how that translates in CO2 emissions. Here, we actually have two possible futures. Depending on the policies that will be taken, as represented by our scenarios, CO2 emissions from the sector could either rise or fall. Now, under the current policies, we see that CO2 emissions would grow almost 25% by 2050. Now, of course, comparing with the demand growth, which is about 100%, 114%, as shown in the previous slide, we see that there is reduction on the carbon intensity. However, it is not enough to decouple CO2 emissions from demand growth. However, on the other scenario, as you can see on the Reshape Plus, CO2 emissions could be reduced by as much as 57%. Here, we do have this decoupling between demand and CO2 emissions. But let's not forget that in order to reach the result outlined by this scenario, it will be necessary to leverage some of the after effects and the recovery packages of the pandemic. Now, let's talk a bit more specifically about aviation. Aviation, which is a significant part of the sector, will recover. It will recover, according to our estimates, by 2025, and it will continue growing. By 2050, air travel could almost triple when compared to the 2015 levels. And as I mentioned before, it is important to point out that decarbonizing aviation is hard. A lot of breakthroughs, technological design, or in policies will be needed in order for us to reduce emissions from aviation. However, as you can see on the graph, on the Reshape Plus scenario, we actually do have a reduction on the demand for air travel, at least compared to the current trajectory, the recover scenario. This is a result of the various policies taken, which lead to a mode shift, at least for short distance travel, which now can be done by surface modes, such as high-speed rail, but also as a result of trends such as teleconferencing and increased local tourism, which will reduce overall aviation demand. And now with this, I conclude my presentation and I pass the floor to my colleague, Vatsalia Sohu.
Thank you very much, Dimitris, for those very insightful findings. As Dimitris mentioned, carbon emissions from this sector could be 57% lower in 2050 as compared to 2015, with ambitious policies that leverage the decarbonization opportunities of COVID-19 recovery. I will now present our key takeaways in this context. To begin with, our results show that technological improvements offer the most promising path to achieve the targets in this sector. This can be explained through the avoid, shift, improve approach in this context. So, avoiding travel by leveraging the trends that have emerged in the aftermath of the pandemic. For example, promoting local tourism and encouraging teleworking and video conferencing to avoid business trips. Secondly, shifting to cleaner modes, substituting short-haul flights for high-speed rail travel. This can be encouraged through designing recovery packages that help shift travel from air to rail. And we've already seen this, for example, with the French recovery package. And lastly, improving energy efficiency. For road transport, this can mean promoting the use of more energy efficient vehicles. And for aviation, this means encouraging new aircraft designs and the deployment of hybrid and electric aircraft, as well as increasing the use of sustainable aviation fuels through mandates. Moving on, to ensure the transition to low carbon mobility, it is important to increase consumer confidence in cleaner technologies and to push for a cleaner energy grid. Now, in order to increase consumer confidence, it is important to deploy charging infrastructure along intercity and regional networks to overcome range anxiety and accelerate adoption. Major push can also come from incentives. This can be through purchase subsidies, tax rebates, tax exemptions for electric vehicles. Specifically targeting rapid electrification of high usage fleets like vehicles and ride-hailing fleets can also have a very big impact. Secondly, pursuing a cleaner energy grid is key, as regional travel comes to rely more and more on electricity. Without green electricity, transport emissions will simply shift to the energy sector instead of being mitigated. And when we talk about pursuing a cleaner energy grid, it is very important to point out that emerging economies, which are still highly dependent on fossil fuels, must prioritize a transition to a greener grid. Last but certainly not the least, putting a price on carbon will discourage high emission transport and make cleaner alternatives more attractive. Here, carbon taxes can play an important role in making CO2 intensive transport internalize the environmental as well as societal cost of carbon emissions. Additionally, when we talk about a just transition, it is important to design revenue neutral and fair schemes so as to not leave behind the less affluent. Lower income groups often bear the brunt of regressive taxation. Hence, it is essential to design these programs in a way that avoids unfair burden on these vulnerable groups. This can also mean using the revenue from carbon pricing to fund incentives for clean mobility so as to increase the acceptability of these alternatives. Now, to quickly summarize, we see from our findings that demand for regional and intercity travel will grow strongly regardless of the scenario. We also see a rebound in aviation and continued growth till 2050. This means that decoupling emissions from travel demand will be crucial, and it is possible to reduce emissions from this sector by 57% in 2050, only through deploying ambitious policies and leveraging the recovery from the pandemic. As mentioned, this can be achieved through measures like increased deployment of technological improvements and ensuring consumer confidence in them, greening the electricity grid, and implementing carbon taxation schemes that prioritize equity. I finish here, and I would like to thank you all very much for your time. And with that, I hand it back to our colleague, Maliti.
Thank you very much, Vatsalya and Demetrius, for those findings and those practical insights as to how we might achieve them. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Simone Rawa from Airbus, who will be starting off our discussion, bringing an industry perspective, specifically from the aviation sector. Simone, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Maliti, for the invitation to this important summit, and good day to everyone connected. So it's a pleasure to be here. So yes, first of all, I would like to say that it's very encouraging to see that the aviation sector is expected also in the ITF transport outlook to recover within all the three scenarios. The impacts have been particularly hard for the aviation sector. In the worst times, international traffic was down to 90%, and even today, more than 1 year later, the international traffic is still only at 25%. So the socioeconomic impacts are tremendous in the sector, but not only, also in its ecosystem. So for example, just to look at the tourism industry. So the recovery from this crisis remains the first priority for the sector. But being more positive and looking ahead, what is already clear today is that the sector will recover, and coming out of this crisis it will recover differently. It will not be the same anymore. It will change significantly. So the current economic situation of the sector will lead to restructuration probably, and foremost to efficiency improvements of the system, which will bring a lot of opportunities also for the environment, for example, and to build back better as a whole. The fact that society's environmental considerations and awareness have increased significantly over the past years and accelerated by the crisis have made sustainability, I would say, the second first priority of the sector. So all this will require strong commitment and focused collaboration of all the stakeholders inside and outside the industry, and particularly also the energy sector, including strong and supportive policies and incentivizations. We at Airbus, we strongly believe in the significant social and economic benefits aviation brings to the society, uniting and connecting people, it has been said before, cultures and economies, offering at the same time very high system flexibility and speed. That's very important. And we also strongly believe in the capability of the aviation sector, including Airbus, to deliver the necessary innovation and breakthrough technologies. This was also highlighted, for example, by the Secretary General's opening speech on the need for innovation. So for Airbus, sustainable aviation fuels and hydrogen solutions are the most significant and promising decarbonization means. But of course, all measures, including ATM and operations of improvement, as well as market-based measures, are very important parts of the industries and Airbus decarbonization plans. So has been said also before, no one solution. So today, there's a lot of innovation ongoing in the sector, from startups to other bigger players to work on decarbonization. And Airbus specifically has recently presented its 3 zero-emission hydrogen-powered concept planes. We're working ahead, working on the technologies and pressing ahead on the hydrogen combustion and modified gas turbine engines, for example, but also fuel cells technologies. So our ambition is to bring the first commercial zero-emission plane to market by 2035. So these planes are all addressing short to medium range intercity and intracontinental travel with ranges between 1,000 and 2,000 nautical miles. So falling also definitely into the report scope, and with capacities between up to 100 and 200 seats. So those future innovations, but also other environmental aspects such as biodiversity, infrastructure, land use, are to be considered in the future demand and intermodality modeling and planning, as well for policy modeling. So as well, time and cost aspects for different modes are to be considered to make these modes able to offer similar connectivity. It's just an example because it was mentioned in the forthgoing presentation. The shift from the proposed shift from plane to high-speed rail. There is a considerative time aspect to be looked at, and the Eurocontrol EU special report from 2018, for example, has estimated the completion time of a high-speed rail route to be roughly 26 years. So by then, and having this achieved on a global scale as well, because we have talked about Europe, but this is not the same for the global scale. Aviation will have significantly reduced its environmental footprint on those same routes, for example. So at Airbus, we are really focusing on providing the right technologies so that the society's demand and need for connectivity and future connectivity can be met, but in a sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone. It's great to hear from what Airbus is doing to meet their decarbonization ambitions and all the innovation that's going on, and also some of the priorities and factors that you're looking at. You mentioned looking at time and cost, and looking beyond that at biodiversity and all these other impacts that that stem way beyond. So it is very much a big problem, and it's great to have you speaking on behalf of Airbus to see where the industry is going. So I think it is now time for us to close the poll and see what the audience would like to say in terms of decarbonizing this non-urban passenger sector. I'm just going to end the poll here and share the results. So again, as in the last session, we do not have a clear winner, but some of the more popular choices are decarbonization opportunities for non-urban passenger transport lie in demand management, reducing trip distances and shifting to less polluting modes. Followed very closely, that was at 25%. 22% is looking at alternative powertrains, electric, hybrid electric, etc. And even infrastructure developments and uptake of policies mandating blended fuels aren't too far behind. So I'll say demand management and alternative powertrains kind of won this poll, but the one option that is lagging far behind is pricing mechanisms, which got 6% of the votes. So this is a kind of a mixed bag of results, which probably represents exactly what you mentioned, Simone, that there are a number of policies that we need and paths that we need to take. Perhaps I will come to you first and then followed by Demetrius for some comments on these results. Simone?
Yes, that's very interesting, and somehow it would be interesting to know where these where the people are coming from that have participated to the poll, because demand management, of course, is something very which is looked at very much in particular in Europe and in the Western countries, of course. So we in Airbus, we don't believe that a forced demand management is the right thing to do, because we believe that people do want to travel. They need to travel. The economies need to exchange. And we do see actually the solutions rather in providing, as I mentioned earlier, the right technologies so that actually future generation can benefit from all the positive impacts of aviation, but in a sustainable way. It is clear that there needs to be decarbonization pushed forward, and the industry as well as Airbus, we have clear plans in place. So the ATAC report, for example, as well needs to be mentioned in this discussion, because it has been shown that there is the possibility that aviation can grow in a sustainable manner with the right policies, with the right actions, with the right technology developments in place, and therefore, actually, to allow people to move and connect as they wish in a sustainable way is for us the main viewpoint. And it's also looking. It's also interesting to see that there's such a big discrepancy between demand management and pricing mechanism, because pricing mechanisms are part of demand management, but it's rather a market-based demand management. So it's interesting because they go together somehow, and there seems to be a very big gap in the poll answers. So interesting to see.
Thank you, Simone. Perhaps Demetrius, this is something that maybe you could touch on as well. So pricing mechanisms got the least number of votes. Perhaps that is something you'd like to touch on.
Thank you very much. I have to say, I wasn't expecting pricing mechanisms to be dead last, but it is. It does seem that people think about very much with how a measure would impact them. So if people are thinking that pricing mechanisms would increase the cost of flying, people are very averse to that. So this could be a possible explanation. Another reasoning could be that the complexity and the different parties involved in any sort of pricing mechanisms, if done universally, would be very complex. So that would be another reason for the low responses. I want to touch a bit on the demand management and the alternative powertrain options, which got the most votes. I mean, definitely demand management could be a solution, but the worry is that it is limited in distance, meaning it could have a big impact in what we call regional transport. It could have an impact, like when we're talking about people doing short trips, daily trips, over the weekend trips, things that are usually nearby. There could be efforts either from policymakers, other stakeholders to try to reduce those trips or make them happen with more sustainable modes. But as Simone mentioned, it is important for long distance travel to exist because it connects people, it connects economies, and it facilitates the growth of the sector and the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Demetrius. So I think that is it for our interactive discussion portion. I'd like to thank you, Simone, for joining us. It's been great to have you sharing your insights. And right now, I'd like to invite Luis Martinez, our lead.
They think that an aviation flying would have to have a minimum share of sustainable aviation fuel, or you could have soft nudges. You could make the cost of sustainable aviation fuel reduce either through economic support for companies making them, or with other incentives, making the cost of sustainable aviation fuel lower so that airliners would then take it.
Thank you, Demetrius. We appear to potentially be having some audio issues, so I hope in the background we're able to fix that quickly, and apologies if you're not hearing this. We also have a question about modal shift. This was mentioned in the presentation and by Simone's points. We're talking about a shift from air to rail. Do we expect big investments in rail now or into the 2040s, or do you believe that there's a lack of vision? Perhaps I will come to Luis with this question on investments in rail.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Mariti, for the question, and hi all. I would say that there is some plans that we internalize in the model, that the model predicts the growth on rail corridors, especially in high-speed rail or in ultra-high-speed like maglev or Hyperloop, if they potentially may happen in the future. We have internalized which are the plans that are already underway either in Europe or in Asia or in other regions of the world. But there are also others that we do a simplified cost-benefit analysis where they can become appealing as an alternative. These are already then included, and also they have one element that is in modal shift, but there is also an element of inducing demand also as part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. So we have a question on pricing mechanisms, and perhaps I will direct this to Vatsalya. Are pricing mechanisms designed to internalize external costs? Can you give us a bit more on the theory behind pricing mechanisms and why they might be important?
Oh, thank you, Malidi, for that question. Yes, indeed. So pricing mechanisms, carbon taxes, are basically meant to internalize the cost of emissions, the environmental, the societal cost of emissions that these transport modes have. So putting a price on these high emission transport modes discourages, in a way, penalizes these high emission transport modes, and at the same time makes the cleaner alternatives that are already available more lucrative, more acceptable. So the whole idea behind pricing, carbon pricing, and applying taxes on these emissions is to discourage these modes which are highly emitting and encourage the alternatives that are already available.
Thank you, Vatsalya. I have a question on electric cars. Perhaps I will ask Demetrius to take a first stab at this. The question is asking about the fact that private cars, or electric private cars, have a rather low range at the moment, given their charging requirements. And given that this is one of the limits, we have a kind of a thought experiment here. Could we imagine that the train industry builds new types of high-speed trains that improves the capability to transport private electric cars in order to increase distance coverage? Is this something you would consider? Have you thought about this in the models?
Thank you very much for that question. I have to say this is rather something that we haven't thought. This is something that does occur currently in very specific corridors. For example, crossing the English Channel, you do have cars going on top of trains. Now, generally speaking, I would say that the range anxiety, as this is commonly referred, is something that should go away as the time progresses, because technology will develop and cars will have bigger range. But this is something that could also be countered by having high-speed charging stations at roads, at intercity roads, which would allow those electric vehicles to be recharged during the trip.
Thank you, Demetrius. We have, it appears that the sustainable aviation fuel question, the answer to that question was when there was an audio glitch that happened. So perhaps, Demetrius, we could go back to the question on sustainable aviation fuels, and you could comment quickly, again, on the current trends and how we might be able to encourage more airlines to shift to these fuels.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll be very brief. I mentioned that in our recover scenario, which represents the current trajectory, fuel mandates go up to 15 to 25% in 2050, depending on the region. And that on the policies that you could use to encourage that, we have two types. We have hard nudges, which are fuel mandates, which mandate that airlines operating from a certain country would use certain share of sustainable aviation fuel. And then you have soft nudges, which would reduce the price or encourage the adoption of sustainable aviation fuel through various motivation, through various means in order to increase their adoption. Thank you.
Thank you, Demetrius, for repeating that answer. Before we end for this session, we have a few more minutes. I'd like to direct a question to Louise. This has come out of the summit in plenary panel that took place yesterday. ICAO discussed how during the pandemic, the aviation hub and spoke model has taken a significant hit. And some companies are deciding to redesign how their networks are built to adapt to these changes. Louise, could you comment perhaps on how this might influence cost of air travel, connectivity of air travel, and the resulting CO2 emissions?
Yes, thank you, Maliti, for the question. Of course, it will impact connectivity and also cost of air travel. I'll start by the end for your question regarding the travel distances and then the passenger kilometers. If we have a more origin to destination connection and less hub and spoke, we may have less passenger kilometers, and then we have, in theory, we would have less emissions. Yet, if this directs as having lower load factors, this may even not compensate at all. I think that this rebalance we have for regional travel, this may happen more direct travel and less indirect. For very long distance, the hub and spoke has proven us even to be more efficient because we cannot maintain really highly frequent connections with low demand to be competitive even from market prices, but also from an environmental perspective. Then it will be a readaptation of hub and spoke systems, I would say, at regional level and different from the global level, as it happened nowadays already with low cost companies that they do not operate normally hub and spoke systems.
Thank you, Louise. I have a question for Vatsalya about, there's a comment, but I believe it leads very nicely into a question. We have a comment on why perhaps pricing mechanisms was not very popular in our poll. And one of the things that we need to be aware of is that when you put in place pricing mechanisms, it's not really necessarily going to help demand management unless there are alternatives in place that people can choose. So can you talk a little bit more, Vatsalya, about how these alternatives can come about, what policymakers can do with pairing pricing mechanisms with these other alternatives?
Thank you so much for the question, Mike. It's indeed a very important question and something that we must address. So as long as there are no alternatives, it is true that pricing mechanisms will not be popular. It's quite obvious why they won't be popular, because if you increase the price of using private vehicles and you don't provide people with alternatives, it's not going to be a popular choice indeed. So in order to make pricing mechanisms effective, I think it's very important to, at the same time, increase infrastructure for, say, electric vehicles, as Dimitris mentioned earlier and has been mentioned in several sessions before as well. Deploying charging infrastructure for rural areas, for regional travel is very important when we put pricing mechanisms in place so that people have the option of choosing the cleaner alternatives and have the, in order to, say, mitigate range anxiety, which is one of the reasons why these areas have low uptake of electric vehicles. Apart from that, I think it's also important to mention that pricing mechanisms are often unfairly, harmful to vulnerable groups. So that's something that must be kept in mind when these pricing mechanisms are designed or pricing incentives are designed. So for example, when you put a carbon tax or an energy tax, they can be made revenue neutral and fair by recycling the revenue into labor subsidies or into other type of subsidies for cleaner alternatives. So there are a lot of ways to design these pricing mechanisms, subsidies and incentives in a way that they are fair and just and do not have adverse distribution impacts. It's just a matter of designing them carefully so as to make sure that they are accepted and at the same time providing alternatives that help shift from highly emitting modes to cleaner modes.
Thank you, Vatsalya. I think that's a good spot for us to finish off today because we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining us for the non-urban passenger transport session of the Outlook launch. Thank you to Demetrius, Vatsalya, and Louise for your insights and your presentation. A very special thanks to Simone Raua for joining us from Airbus. For more information on the Outlook, you are welcome to visit the exhibition stage at the ITF Summit, where you can download the executive summary for free in 9 different languages. Our ITF webpage also provides links to the publication, our modeling results, which are up on the OECD Stats database, and recordings of these sessions once those are available. If you would like to join us for the next session, our last session of the morning program on freight transport, please stick around. You can navigate to that session using the Back to Timeline link on the top left-hand corner. That's it from me. Thank you all.